My name is Tori Nagash, and I serve as the Research Initiatives Manager at Akuhuai. And again, I'm excited to welcome you to today's Endorsed Research webinar, Examining Student Spiritual Development by Residence Hall Directors. A significant focus of the Akuhuai research agenda is to disseminate research about housing and residence life in the field, and endorsed research is one way that we achieve this. Akuhuai and the Akuhuai Research Committee invite endorsed research applications for issues related to campus housing, including those that align with the Akuhuai research agenda priorities of public-private partnerships, student outcomes, and student success. If you're interested in applying or learning more, you can find information about endorsed research under Research and Data in the Knowledge Resources area of the Akuhuai website. Before we begin, I did want to share a few housekeeping notes. The live transcript feature is enabled, so you should be able to turn on subtitles during this webinar if those are needed. Also, please feel free to post any questions you might have in the chat as I will be monitoring what is shared there, but these may not be answered until the Q&A time at the end of our session. All right, with that, I will now turn things over to our presenter.
All right, thank you so much, Tori. Thanks for everyone else for spending an afternoon with me. My name is Rob Engblom. I'm the Associate Director for Resident Learning in the Office of Campus Living and Learning down here in Waco, Texas, Baylor University. And so I'm excited to share my research with you. Just a quick presentation overview. I'll talk a little bit about myself and just kind of what got me interested in this topic. We'll talk briefly as well just about kind of a more recent history of what spirituality looks like in higher education. But then from there, we'll kind of move into the actual research, which includes my questions, the methodology, and of course, the fun part, the actual findings, and we'll have some time for discussion at the end as well. Tori is going to monitor the chat, so if there's something that makes sense to ask while I'm on the slide and you get in there fast enough, Tori will flag me down, but if not, don't worry, we'll leave some time at the end to discuss that as well. So again, just a little bit more about me. I am almost 23 years completed as a higher education and specifically student housing professional. And my interest in spirituality in higher education and the residence halls goes all the way back to my second year as a hall director at Ball State University. So just the second year in my position as a new professional. I was a hall director at Ball State on September 11th, 2001, which was, of course, a horrific day in our country's history. But one of the lasting memories and impacts that event had on my trajectory, my journey, was trying to help students process that. And so I had numerous conversations with students who were asking, you know, what's the meaning of life related to this? Why would God let something like this happen? And the questions they were asking me as a professional staff member, trying to help them process what was happening, you know, this wasn't in the crisis manual. These kind of big, kind of life-altering questions, and so it really got me interested in kind of, you know, how do students make meaning, especially around some of these kind of large-scale world events. That's really what kind of triggered my background interest in this. But about 3 years ago, I started the Educational Leadership Doctoral Program at Tarleton State University. And as with any doctoral program, you need a dissertation. And so that's where I moved into this research interest of, you know, what do hall directors, what is their intersection with spiritual development on college campuses? We'll kind of get to that here in a couple of slides. But it was worth kind of talking just a little bit again about a more recent history of spirituality in higher education. You know, a lot of this kickstarts, you can kind of go back to Fowler's book, Stages of Faith, originally published in 1981. But this is one of the very first authored publications that talk about what faith development looks like. And faith is slightly different than spiritual development, but there's a lot of overlap in what that looks like. And it was actually Parks who used Fowler's kind of stages of faith and kind of adapted that into her own faith development, spiritual development theory. But hers was really specifically focused on what that looks like in higher education, and specifically with young adults. And so that was right at the turn of the century in 2000. kind of the same time, Parker Palmer's The Courage to Teach, some other authors in the broader education field were starting to talk about these meaning-making, spirituality driven conversations. From there, that's when the field of student affairs specifically started to get a lot more invested in this topic of spiritual development as well. And so that's when, right around 2006, was when Art Chickering, John Dalton, and STAM printed their book, Encouraging Authenticity and Spirituality in Education. John Dalton, of course, was a big believer in the spiritual development, incorporated that when he was down at Florida State University. Florida State had a lot of kind of sponsored research around that topic. But it was really Aston and Aston, husband and wife out of UCLA, with their higher education, spirituality and higher education research project that culminated in their book, Cultivating the Spirit. And so the Astons were able to do a longitudinal study, thousands of students, where they really kind of tracked the spiritual development progress of college students. And we're able to identify some specific aspects of spirituality in the research, but even more impactfully for my research, they were able to identify specific activities in college that they were able to determine leads to spiritual development in college students. And I'll get to that a little bit more too. So, those are kind of some of the big books around spiritual development, but there's certainly been a lot of other research. And so what we kind of know from the last, 20, 25 years around spiritual development in higher education research, we know just from a developmental age, a traditionally aged college student is ripe for spiritual growth. Fowler, Parks, they would all say it's that kind of age range between 18 and 25, 18 and 30, that most young adults kind of galvanize what their spirituality means, what their faith development looks like. We also know a ton of research, again, primarily through the Astons, but a lot of other secondary research too. So there are a lot of positive outcomes when students grow spiritually in college. And so that includes retention, that includes academic success, that includes graduation rates, that even includes one article I listened to said less hedonistic behavior. So, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, I guess, is what they're referring there. But we just know there's a lot of positive outcomes related to students who are growing spiritually in college. Some of the other concurrent research too, though, really suggests faculty, they don't want to touch this. They tend to really distance themselves from what spiritual development might look in the classroom, within that academic context. And so if we know college students are ripe for that growth, if we know there's positive outcomes related to that, kind of, that work kind of defaults to the area of student affairs, kind of what we do. And so, housing and residence life certainly falls under that umbrella. And there's a good amount of literature out there too that are saying, hey, not only could we do it, we probably should be doing that within higher ed and specifically within housing and residence life. And so with that as a background, it kind of led to where my research interests for my dissertation were kind of moving towards. And essentially I was asking, are residence hall directors prepared to develop spirituality in college students? If we know it's good, if we know they're right for it, and we know there are other areas of the university that are reluctant to do it, why not us? Why not residence hall directors who have such intimate daily interactions with college students? All right. So I developed 6 research questions related to this topic. First, I just want to know, do hall directors think it's important to help students develop spiritually? There's not any real data out there that kind of indicates, what do new professionals, actually think about this? I also want to know, how relevant are different aspects of spirituality in the lives of hall directors? And I'll talk a little bit about this Ballard and Bogue spirituality scale, which I used for my survey instrument. We also want to know, to what extent do hall directors feel prepared to develop these different aspects of spirituality in college students? And then I was particularly interested in, is how relevant an aspect of spirituality is. Does that correlate or relate to maybe how prepared a new professional would feel in developing that in students as well. I also wanted to look at, are there different identities or different factors or characteristics of a hall director that might impact whether different aspects of spirituality are relevant to them, or if there are, if that maybe impacts how confident or prepared they feel to develop, those spirituality factors in college students. And then finally, I was just curious. What we knew from the Aston study was we've got these 10 activities that occur in college that the Astons identified as being positively related to spiritual growth. And so we'll take a look at that here in this slide. This was kind of what my conceptual framework looked like moving towards the dissertation. So I knew that based on the Aston's research, there are some activities in college that produce spiritual growth, and they're not even necessarily labeled as spiritual growth. They were just able to determine through their longitudinal study, hey, if students engage in these kind of things while they're in college, it tends to lead to spiritual growth. And so that included academic courses with service learning components, studying abroad, spending significant time studying, having interdisciplinary academic courses. If you were a part-time student, employment, that's a big thing Housing and Residence Life does. We have a lot of part-time student employees working in our residence halls. If you encourage volunteer work, if students have an opportunity to get involved in charitable giving, if students are self-reflecting or even spending time meditating, if they're having interracial interactions, and then if they're encountering leadership training, we know that's gonna grow students spiritually. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, Rob, what's your operational definition of spirituality? What exactly do you mean by spirituality? Does that include religion? Because for me, it doesn't, or it better include religion, because for me, that's a big part of my spirituality. Well, that's why I gravitated towards this Ballard Bogue spirituality scale, because they identified 10 different aspects of spirituality, some of which include maybe more specifically religious connotations, some of which are much less explicitly related to religion. So these 10 different aspects of spirituality they identified were belief in a divine entity, belief in a reality beyond the physical world, spending time in reflection, prayer, meditation, the study of sacred documents, and again, that's a really, really wide definition, attending religious and or spiritual events, developing a sense of meaning of life, having hope in a time of stress, what they would call right moral and ethical behavior, celebrating key junctures in life, and then finally having concerns beyond one's own self-interest. And so I entered this research work thinking, okay, if students are experiencing these activities, they should be experiencing growth around some of these different factors. But I wonder kind of where hall directors clock in with how they identify around these spirituality factors. So this was a quantitative study. I know for some folks, you're like, there's no way I'd ever do a quantitative study. If you are thinking about a doctoral program or even currently in one, haven't decided on your dissertation, don't be scared of the numbers. For me, SPSS was way less scary than trying to sift through qualitative interviews or focus groups and trying to develop themes. I felt more comfortable pushing buttons, but I promise you, if I can do a quantitative study, you can too. But through my study, I produced both descriptive and inferential statistics. I did take a non-probability approach, and that was when I approached Akuhoi and said, "Hey, you've got a listserv that goes to a lot of different college housing departments, not just in North America, across the world. I would love to be able to get access to that to send the survey out to hall directors." So that would be what you call a convenient sampling approach. And so yeah, I was very fortunate to have Akuhoi endorse it. The research committee endorsed this, and that was one of their one of the only qualifications for it was, hey, will you please promise to share this again? So that's why I'm here this afternoon. So yeah, we sent that survey out to the Akuhoi listserv. I also posted it in a secondary location as well. So on Facebook, there's a group called Residence Life Professionals. And so I did post a link to the survey there as well. Survey site was hosted by Qualtrics at the Tarleton State University campus. So I had IRB approval. I got that distributed. And then we did have a carrot to get folks to complete the survey. I gave out $10 Starbucks gift cards. So if by chance you won that and are on this call right now, I hope you enjoyed your coffee. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how many hall directors responded and what that looked like. So I had 142 different hall directors start the survey. Technically, it was 143. I did have a respondent from England, but, and this will make more sense when I talk about the regional associations, we ended up eliminating any responses that fell outside of Canada or the United States, just based on the regional associations category we had. But yeah, 142 respondents started the survey. 93 made it to the end of the survey. And then we did have respondents from all 9 North American regional associations affiliated with the KUHOI. Although I'll tell you, our 3 regional associations that are kind of the Rocky Mountains and West, we only had 2 respondents from each of those regions. So I wasn't quite sure how to interpret the lower response rate from those regionals, from those regions, geographic regions of the country, but we'll spend a little bit of time on that later in the presentation too. So yeah, some more RHD respondent information. If I could change one thing about the whole study, it would be this category where the terminology I use kind of intermix definitions that would between gender and sex. And so that was intentional because the source I was using in generating the survey was encouraging to have a broader, less definitive difference, just to try to account for what people's understanding of the difference between the two is. But if I could do it all over again, it's particularly knowing that it's going to be hall directors responding and that they probably have a better understanding just through professional development and knowledge and education, I probably would have had a gender and a sex category. But you can see there, I did have a transgender female, transgender male option as well. Those were not selected. No, none of the respondents selected from those categories. So these were the categories that were selected. We did have 2 who picked the other category where you could fill in kind of a qualitative response. And so one person identified as non-binary, one person identified as questioning. Ethnicity, respondents were allowed to choose as many different ethnicities as were relevant to their identities. Also had the other categories, I had 1 Native Hawaiian. For the purpose of processing some of the information though, for those respondents who picked more than 1 ethnicity category, I did have to kind of create a multi-ethnic category just for the process of crunching the numbers through our statistical software. So great. A couple other categories too. I had 2 different institution types that you could choose. Do you work at a public or do you work at a private? And then I also had 6 different options for what level of education I had the hall director completed, and that went from high school all the way up to a terminal doctoral Juris Doctorate degree. But for my respondents, they only fit in 2 categories, which included having completed a bachelor's degree, having completed a master's degree. So for my descriptive statistics, just around the methodology, I just want to know, do hall directors think it's important to develop students? That was going to be descriptive statistics. The spirituality factors, which ones are relevant to hall directors, how prepared they are, what spiritual development activities are RHDs currently implementing. Those are what we call descriptive statistics. But for the inferential statistics, where we kind of had to do some more statistically oriented procedures, that really fit around these 2 questions. Is there a relationship between personal relevance and how prepared a hall director is to develop these factors? And then what hall director characteristics influence personal relevance or how prepared a hall director is to develop these spirituality factors? So that's a lot on the methodology side, and it's not nearly as interesting as the findings. So let's go ahead and scoot right over those, because I think this is where there's some really neat stuff that we uncovered. So first, my first research question, what level of importance do hall directors assign to the goal of developing student spirituality? You'll see from the results in the table on the left-hand side, about 52% of the hall director respondents thought it was important or very important to develop students spiritually, which means there's about 48% or so who did not think, or maybe were undecided on whether it was important to develop spirituality. So that was interesting. It's kind of almost a 50-50 split right there. And we'll talk about what the implications of that looks like. But it's particularly interesting to me because of prior research where we know there's a lot of positive outcomes related to students who experience spiritual development in college. But here we are looking at new professionals who might have the opportunity to do that developing, maybe not even believing or understanding that could be important. My next question was, hey, what relevance do these hall directors place on each of these 10 spirituality factors? And so I've divided these 10 spirituality factors into those which had a high median score, those that had a median score, and those that came on the lower side. And what you might notice as you're looking at these or as you're reading these are those that are less religiously overt. They tend to have the higher median rankings, and some of those that were maybe a little bit more religiously oriented were more in the medium lower category as far as, what's that personal relevance. So that high median area was living a life of meaning and purpose, experiencing a source of hope in times of stress, and then having concern for others beyond one's self-interest. I suspect if I were to come to your campus and look at some of maybe your developmental goals, learning goals that you have for your students living on campus, there's probably going to be some overlap there as far as what you're trying to achieve within your residential communities. Then on that low median side, studying sacred texts, regular attendance at spiritual activities, that was on the lower side as far as how relevant it was for hall directors. Now, an interesting thing happens because with research question 3, I ask, hey, to what extent do hall directors feel prepared to develop these 10 different aspects of spirituality in college students? So we actually have these same 3 in the high category, the high median category that we did in research question number 2, which is living a life of meaning and purpose, experiencing a source of hope in times of stress, concern for others beyond one's self-interest. The hall directors, I was able to survey, they felt like they were ready to do that work in helping college students develop. But you'll see 2 spirituality factors move from the median column to the low median. And that included belief in a divine entity and belief in a reality beyond the visible. So that's an area where hall directors did not feel as prepared to develop that aspect of spirituality in college students. But those other 3 in the medium category, regular practice of reflection and prayer, experiencing a guide to right action, celebrating key rituals, that stayed the same, as did the last 2 in the low category, studying sacred texts and regular attendance at spiritual activities. So as we look kind of at the difference between number 2, we look at the difference in number 3, my next question was, is there a relationship between how important that maybe is each of these spirituality categories are to a hall director, the relationship between that and how prepared they would feel to develop that in students, across those. And so for that, we did a correlational analysis, calculated the Spearman rank coefficient, and I'm excited to share you this because across all 10 spirituality factors, we found that there was a statistically significant relationship between how a hall director felt about that spirituality factor in their own life and how that would maybe impact their ability to develop that in students. So there's a very high correlation across all aspects of spirituality. Where you're at personally with that spirituality factor is definitely correlated with your confidence or how prepared you feel in developing that in college students. So yeah, all those were at the significant level of 0.001. If you've taken a stats class, you're typically in the social sciences looking for a 0.05 or less. But this cleared that in all these categories. But because my chair was particularly cruel, he said, Rob, you should probably just try to measure the effect sizes. It's one thing to say something is statistically significant, but when you measure effect sizes, that also kind of tells you, is how much is it but in that relationship that's going on, or are there other external factors? And so if you look at this right column here, you'd see there's a large effect size in the categories of and the factors related to belief in a divine creator, practice of reflection and prayer, study of sacred documents, guide to right action, and celebrating key rituals. And then there's a medium effect size for belief in a reality beyond the visible, attendance at spiritual activities, life of meaning and purpose, and hope in times of stress, as well as having concern for others beyond one's self-interest. So there's definitely something happening here in this kind of relationship between how a hall director feels about these different aspects of spirituality and how prepared they feel in developing those aspects of spirituality in college students. So, you know, you don't know what you're going to experience as you jump into that, but it was, it was a really, really exciting moment when you hit the button on SPSS and those numbers pop out because you realize you've hit onto something. So I will use that as a springboard on to research question 5. I just want to know, are there different aspects of a hall director? So gender, ethnicity, what geographic region they're employed, whether their institution is public or private, or what their level of education is. Does that at all impact the importance of a spirituality factor in their life, or even their sense of being prepared to develop these different aspects of spirituality? So for this, for these categories that had more than 2 response options, we did a Kruskal-Wallis test. And then for those that only had 2 response options, that's where we did the Mann-Whitney test. So this again produced some kind of cool, interesting findings. So around that aspect of gender, when we look at belief in a divine entity, how prepared hall directors feel to develop that in students. There is a statistically significant finding here. Gender does impact whether a hall director feels prepared to develop that. And so again, because my chair is particularly cruel, I'm just kidding. I love Dr. Glom, and he was a fantastic chair, but he said you should really do a secondary test and try to figure out, is there a statistically significant difference between specific identities and gender? And so when we did that test, we actually did find there was a difference between females and males, with male respondents having a higher mean rank than female respondents in feeling prepared to develop belief in a divine entity. Furthermore, around gender, around belief in a reality beyond the visible, when it comes to feeling prepared to develop that in college students, again, we found that was statistically significant, and that specifically between females and males, with males again having a higher mean rank than females in that category. When we look at the practice of reflection and prayer, whether hall directors feel prepared to develop that in college students, we had a statistically significant encounter there. You'll see it was with a smaller to moderate effect size, and when we actually looked at the relationships between specific identities and gender, in that case, we did not find anything significant. So there's something happening there, around that aspect of prepared to develop that aspect of spirituality, but can't dig much deeper than that. Similar to the study of sacred texts, it was a small to moderate effect size, statistically significant, and how hall directors and based on gender are prepared to develop. But when you actually look at the differences between those different identities and gender, we did not see that. I'm going to jump back to this. I actually got a chance to present this at a Kuhoi annual conference this summer, and I opened it up to the room. Is that any theories as to why, for a couple of these categories, the males were coming in ranked higher than the females at a statistically significant rate? I shared my theory. I've seen some of this in research in males and females when they are in the job search process, how males are sometimes more likely to apply for a job that they're not as qualified for. And so my explanation in the group was maybe they are blissfully ignorant as far as how prepared they really are to do this work. But I got a really great feedback from the audience. Some wondered if just based on your socialization upbringing, the differences between a male experience and a female experience as far as having a sense of that preparedness, or just opportunities around these categories. And so that would certainly be something interesting to explore with future research. A couple other responses too around gender when it comes to personal relevance. Having a guide to right action, that was a statistically significant difference related to gender and that guide to right action. In this case, it was we tested between the different identities of gender for our gender variant non-conforming respondents. They had a lower mean rank than the male respondents and a lower mean rank than the female respondents, which is interesting. I will stress there were 7 respondents in that gender variant non-conforming category, so I'd be a little hesitant to make any, wild stances or claims on this one study. But it is even just that few of respondents that it did come out statistically significant. Similar to celebrating key rituals as far as how personally relevant that is to the hall directors, that also was significant. But again, those differences being between gender variant non-conforming respondents with males and then gender variant non-conforming respondents with females, then again having lower mean ranks than their male and female peers. From there, we're going to look at ethnicity, which also produced some really intriguing data, I thought. When you think of this concept of belief in a divine entity, both in personal relevance and in prepared to develop, that was statistically significant. In the case of personal relevance, that was a large effect size. And as far as prepared to develop, that was a moderate to large effect size. So we know this is kind of a juicy piece of data here. But specifically, when we did that Dunn pairwise test, Black African respondents had a higher mean rank than their white Caucasian respondents. Same thing with our Black African respondents for prepared to develop, having a higher mean rank than their white Caucasian respondents. I will say in a lot of these categories where the Black African respondents had a higher mean rank than their white Caucasian counterparts, the Latinx respondents typically had a higher mean rank than the white Caucasian peers as well. But I think because I had so few in that category, it didn't come out as statistically significant. But it looks like in a few of these categories here, our staff of color are having a different, seem to have a different background experience related to some of this, which is very intriguing. Same thing with belief in a reality beyond the visible. As far as personal relevance and prepared to develop that spirituality factor, again, those were statistically significant for that personal relevance side. Again, our Black African respondents had a higher mean rank than our white Caucasian respondents. But for the prepared to develop, we did not find a statistically significant difference between specific ethnic identities, but the overall factor was still statistically significant. Again, very similar around practice of reflection and prayer in both personal relevance and how prepared hall directors were to develop that factor. Again, those were significant, large and moderate effect sizes for those two. And again, our Black African respondents having a higher mean rank than our white Caucasian respondents. When you look at the study of sacred texts, that too produced statistically significant differences around ethnicity and personal relevance and prepared to develop. We were able to drill down on the personal relevance category, where again, our Black African, white Caucasian respondents had a higher mean rank than our white Caucasian respondents. Again, meaning our Black African respondents were identifying that as more personally relevant than our white respondents. And I believe the last two are around ethnicity as well when it comes to attending spiritual activities. Again, in both personal relevance prepared to develop, there was statistically significant findings for that personal relevance. We know our Black African respondents, again, had a higher mean rank than our white Caucasian. We're not able to drill down as far on the prepared to develop side. I lied. I think I have one more. Yep, sorry. One more ethnicity category here. Within that spirituality factor of a guide to right action, how personally relevant that is to a hall director, that was statistically significant. And again, specifically when you compare our Black African hall director respondents to our white Caucasian hall director respondents, it was a higher mean rank. Celebrating key rituals as far as how personally relevant that spirituality factor is for hall directors. In this situation, this was a little bit different than some of the other categories, but our Black African respondents had a higher mean rank than both our white Caucasian respondents as well as our Asian respondents. So that was a kind of a wrinkle compared to some of the other categories. And then that how prepared hall directors feel in developing that. There is a statistically significant difference around ethnicity, but we weren't able to drill down between what that looked like between just the different identities under ethnicity. All right, that was a lot. That was a lot of stuff to throw at you. This one will be a little bit easier to process, but around geographic region, I wasn't even entirely sure why I threw this into the survey. I was just curious if, where somebody works, either in the United States or Canada, if that has any sort of impact on how they experience, how a hall director experiences spirituality, or how prepared they are to develop that in students. We did have one statistically significant finding when it came to how prepared hall directors felt to develop a life of meaning and purpose in college students. That was a statistically significant finding. And then we did the pairwise test, so we're comparing regions against region. There was a statistically significant difference between the Nyakuho and Swakuho region, where respondents from the Swakuho region have a higher mean rank than the Nyakuho region. So that was interesting. What was also interesting is when we looked at the other different spirituality factors, although they weren't statistically significant, they were still producing moderate effect sizes across some of the different spirituality factors. So belief in a divine entity, reflection in prayer, study in sacred texts, guide to right action, celebrating key rituals, both personal relevance and how prepared all directors are to develop that. I think what this means is with having 9 different regions that respondents could pick from, I don't think we had enough respondents to produce more statistically significant differences, but that moderate effect size calculation, that definitely demonstrates there's something to this. There's something going on with where a hall director works in the country or Canada, and where they work geographically. So that will be something we'll talk about just a pinch more here. A couple other factors just as far as institution type. I had debated in my research whether to include public, private, and faith-based. I ultimately just went with public and private because there are some institutions, higher ed institutions, that were maybe historically faith-based, but have really moved away from that faith-based identity into more of a private, operationally private, not as connected faith-based. And so that is why I ultimately decided just to go between the two. But since there were only 2 response options, that's why we did the Mann-Whitney test. But what I found was interesting was there was no statistically significant differences in personal relevance or how prepared hall directors are to develop these in any of the 10 spirituality factors. And the effect sizes for this, for every measure, were little or no effect at all. Now, I am guessing that some of those respondents who picked the private option as far as institution type they worked out, I'm guessing some of those probably were faith-based. And so it's very interesting that whether your institution is public or private, that seems to have no impact on how a hall director interprets these spirituality factors or how prepared they are to develop those. This was similar to as far as the level of education goes as well. Again, I had a wide range of options to respond to in this, but we only had respondents who had either completed a bachelor's or a master's. But again, there was no statistically significant difference in personal relevance or how prepared a hall director was to develop these spirituality factors. I even tell you anecdotally, although it wasn't significant, in several of the spirituality factors, it was actually those who had only completed a bachelor's degree. Their mean ranks were sometimes higher, not statistically significantly higher, but higher than their master's level counterparts. And so there's a bit of research out there saying master programs, higher ed master's programs should be preparing students around these topics and helping them not just grow individually, but figure out how to help students grow spiritually as well. And there does not seem to be any evidence that that impact is out there. So my last question, a research question, and we're getting close to the, you can ask questions to me. Thank you for being so patient and listening to all of this. I'd mentioned earlier that the Assens, through their UCLA research, they identified 10 activities that if students participate in while they're in college will produce spiritual growth. And so I was just curious, are hall directors encouraging any of these or facilitating any of these activities in their role as residence hall directors, as they're interacting with the students in their communities? And you'll see 8 out of the 10 categories, that median rank was either agree or strongly agree, which means maybe unbeknownst to them, they're actually helping facilitate spiritual growth in their communities. And if you look at the two activities that have a neutral median rank, that includes the encouraging or facilitating students to select academic courses with service learning components, or encouraging or facilitating charitable giving among students. That probably largely falls outside of what you'd maybe figure to be a hall director's job responsibilities, or what's typically in their job description. When you look at the category that had the highest median response, the strongly agree, that was encouraging or facilitating leadership training for students. And so it was neat to see our hall directors, our new professionals are still doing leadership development, and that was very widely recognized as an activity happening in our residence halls. So I will open it up here for a discussion in a second, but there were just some points I wanted to make, and then we'll kind of open up the chat for anyone else who might have questions or feedback. But just a kind of a brief summary here. When it came to that first research question, do hall directors think spiritual development is important? Well, about half do and about half don't. And so that's probably problematic for us as a field of higher ed student affairs professionals, because we know there's a lot of positive outcomes to students who experience that. It does seem to confirm some of the other literature that's out there that suspects that we are not training new professionals well to do the work of spiritual development in college students. That second research question, do hall directors is there personal relevance across these 10 spirituality factors? The more overtly religious factors, it looked like they were ranked lower. The least religious factors were ranked higher. And I think that's, again, kind of confirms some of the ongoing debate in the literature of how hard it is to have an operational definition of spirituality, when for some that religious component is so central, and for others it wouldn't factor in at all to how they define spirituality. But super intriguing, at least for me, was how prepared were hall directors to develop these 10 spirituality factors. They're even less prepared across all 10 than they were as far as personal relevance. And then you can kind of see where they transition across these 10 factors, from how personally relevant is it to how prepared am I to develop that in college students across these 10 different factors. And so you can kind of see that sense of preparedness start to slide a little bit to the other side. But even with that, we know after this research, there's a super strong relationship between how relevant these different spirituality factors are to a hall director, and how prepared they are to develop that in others. And I think based on what I've tried to find in my lit review and everything else, I think this is really some of the first quantitative data linking personal spiritual growth to the ability to develop that in college students. When we look at these different identities and factors that a hall director possesses, their gender, ethnicity, where they work, their institution type, we know that in some instances, our males are ranking higher in being prepared to develop spirituality. We know in some instances our gender variant non-conforming hall directors are ranking lower. We know 7 out of the 10 spirituality factors were statistically significant around that identity of an ethnicity, and then specifically with our Black African hall director respondents ranking higher. And that confirms some prior research that is out there, particularly around how a lot of our African American Black college students are more dependent on their spirituality as they navigate spaces that may not be as accommodating or welcoming as majority populations. And it could be that experience is carrying over into the new professional hall director experience as well. There was no difference in education. For me, that's a major red flag when a lot of our literature is saying, hey, we should be doing this. There's no difference in institution type. I would guess that if you're working at a private institution, that might sting a little bit, thinking, well, I would have thought maybe the private institutions were engaging in this a little bit more than public institutions. That's not the case. And then what's really fascinating to me is kind of this geographic region output. And so I don't want to draw too much out of this because, again, for our 3 housing associations who were kind of in the Rocky Mountains and west of there, I only had 2 respondents, but you'll remember there was one statistically significant finding around hall directors feeling ready to develop a life of meaning and purpose. The 3 regions with the highest mean ranks on that question, the one that was statistically significant, I've highlighted on this map. And you know, if you've lived in one of these regions before, you might kind of see what I'm getting at. This is often what you might refer to as the Bible Belt within the United States, and so there's probably a secondary study in there too, just trying to maybe trying to parse out do specific regions of our country maybe encourage us more, or our hall directors may be more naturally inclined who want to do this type of work. Are they more, do they drift more to maybe some of these regions of employment too? I'm not entirely sure, but I know there's, again, there are a lot of effect sizes that seem to imply that some regions are more engaged in this than others. So whether hall directors know it or not, they are developing students spiritually to a degree because they are engaged in some of those activities that the Astons put out there as far as being experiences that students can have in college that lead to spiritual development. And so, 8 of those 10 activities were in that agree or strongly agree range. And I did not ask the hall directors who responded, did you know this leads to spiritual development? Maybe I could have, but I suspect maybe that's not, some of those activities aren't maybe as, that may not be what you naturally think of as developing spirituality. So as far as a few recommendations for practice based on my research, I throw it out there. I think we need to educate the student affairs profession on the importance of spiritual development. When you look at that response rate of only about half of our new professionals thinking that was important or very important. I think hall directors should engage in their own spiritual development, and that can be in whatever way you identify or orient towards spiritual growth. Because after this research, it certainly looks like there's a connection between how a residence hall director engages their spirituality and how prepared they feel to develop that in others. I think our housing profession probably needs to better understand some of these unique characteristics and identities as they intersect with spirituality as well, because I think this research certainly uncovered that there's some differences around those. And then for our graduate programs, if there's any faculty listening now or once this is on YouTube in a few days, I think it's clear that we need to concentrate more on spiritual development in graduate programs if we want to increase our understanding of what constitutes spiritual development and why that's important. So lastly, I would just throw it out there, just some future considerations. The UCLA Spirituality in Higher Education study was amazing, but they were really looking at college students from I think it was between 2004 and 2007, we have an entire new generation of college students living in our residence halls today. And so while that was certainly the most uh, robust quantitative study done on spiritual development in college students, it could be out of date, when we think about generational differences. So the level of complexity of that survey is well beyond my abilities, but I'm hoping maybe some faculty who are more versed in that might consider what would an updated longitudinal study look like. The debate around an operational definition for spirituality, continues. I think it would behoove us to continue talking about that. And then finally, hall directors can't do this by themselves. They need broader support to develop spirituality. And so that includes mid-level, upper-level professionals on their campuses. That includes better preparation in their graduate programs. But one of the articles I read in How to Improve This was, our professional associations need to step up to the plate too. So I tip my cap to QOI for letting me do this research and letting me share it, because that just shows the good faith efforts QOI is engaged in as far as trying to spread the word on this topic too. So yeah, I will stop talking. But I'm not sure if there's any questions in the chat folks want to ask or feedback.
No questions shared in the chat yet.
Okay. I'll pop up the references here just so folks can take a look at that if it's relevant. But yeah.
Feel free to unmute if you have a question to share. Well, Rob, it sounds like you did just such a great job explaining everything that there are no questions to be asked.
No
At
worries at
least,
all.
at least now. Maybe they'll write down your email and send you one later.
Absolutely. Well, it was an honor being able to share my research with you. For those of you, again, who are thinking of doctoral work in the future, I highly, highly recommend utilizing the QOI Research Committee. They were fantastic to work with, very supportive, and I wouldn't have my doctorate if it wasn't for their assistance. So thank you, QOI.
Thank you everyone for joining. This will be posted on YouTube on the Akuhoi channel either later this week or early next week. So if you'd like to share the recording with anyone in your network, colleagues, you can look for that there and feel free to do so.